Chapter 30. 7:12 p.m. Arabian Standard Time. 11:12 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Sinjar Mountains, Nineveh Governorate, northwestern Iraq. Run! The thought repeated itself like a mantra. Run! Over and over again. It was all she could think. She had lost the sandals that were on her feet. They had been too big, and now they were gone. She ran as fast as she could in bare feet, stumbling over sharp rocks. Her legs pounded, her arms churned, her lungs screamed for air. Run! It was cold out, but she was hot. They were right behind her. Her feet screamed in pain, cut to ribbons on jagged stone. It was dark out. The cliff was up ahead somewhere. She would run straight off the edge, rather than let the men catch her again. Ahmet was dead. She was sure of it. She had seen it happen. After he freed her, she ran out of the stone building and immediately headed west. But the men saw her right away. There was a group of them down the ridge. They chased her. But then Ahmet came out and started shooting at them. She turned and looked back, just as the men started shooting at him. In the last of the dying light, she saw... It didn't matter. Ahmet didn't matter. He didn't make sense. He had helped them capture her, and then he had died, helping her escape. She couldn't think about that. She had to run. That was all she could do. Suddenly, a burst of light zipped by her from behind. She heard it whistle as it passed. She tripped over something sharp and fell to the ground. Ugh! It hurt. She tore up her hands, her forearms, her knees. Boom! An explosion rent the night, maybe 100 yards in front of her. They were shooting missiles at her. Oh my God! They would blow her up rather than let her kill herself. There was a sound above her now, in the sky, loud and growing louder. Get up! She said to herself through clenched teeth. Get up and run! A burst of machine gun fire passed over her head. It was too late. They were shooting now. She couldn't stand, or they would blow her head off. So she started to crawl. She squirmed over the rocks like a snake. It was too slow. She was never going to make it. A strong hand grabbed her by the collar of her jumpsuit. The collar was tightened by his grip, choking her. The man spun her over onto her back. She hit her head on the hard ground as she landed. It was a man with a thick beard. His eyes seemed to glow. He said something, but she couldn't understand. He raised a pistol to her face. No! She screamed and kicked at him. Suddenly, a bright, blinding light enveloped them both. Kill that guy, Ed Newsom shouted. Kill that guy! The man was illuminated in the bright front light from the chopper. He stood over Elizabeth Barrett, gun pointed at her. Luke leaned out the bay door onto the outside bench. He let it rip with the MP5. He sliced the man in half just above the waist. The two parts, upper and lower, separated and fell apart. Nice, Ed said. We gotta get down there, Luke said. Incoming, Ed shouted. It wasn't the response Luke had hoped for. He dove back inside the chopper, even as it whirled away, banking hard, taking evasive action. A rocket zipped out of the darkness, hit the chopper with a solid metal gong, and bounced away. Luke was on the floor of the cabin, next to the former Greg Welch. What the hell was that? I don't know, Ed said. Must have been homemade. Gentlemen, we can't be here anymore, Jacob said. He sounded almost calm, but not quite. The next one's going to put a hole right through us. You wanted a peek, and you got one. I hope you're satisfied. Negative, Luke shouted. He clambered to his feet, despite the sharp angle the chopper was taking. He stumbled to the cockpit. We have to go down there. She's there. Elizabeth Barrett. I know it's her. The place is crawling with Al-Qaeda. Tell me something I don't know, Rachel said. The chopper was moving fast, very close to the ground. Okay, Stone, Jacob said. Okay. We're going to put you down. But you have to meet me halfway. We're nearly out of fuel. I don't like that terrain. That's fine. Get us close. We'll jump. Then get out of here. But do me a favor and launch those hydras and squirt those guys with your cannon before you go." Jacob nodded. "Okay. Good luck. 10 seconds. Luke stepped across the cabin to Ed. Ed was crouched in the bay door with the M79 grenade launcher, looking for a target. Luke clapped him on the back. "Come on, man. We're going in." "Out of sight," Ed said. He went out the bay door and clambered over the outside bench. Already the chopper was hovering. An instant later, Ed was gone. Luke followed him out. His MP5 was still in hand. He slipped over the bench. The chopper was hovering right at the cliff's edge. The ground was 5 or 6 feet below him. Just ahead, Ed Newsom was running in a low crouch toward the action. A rocket came screaming out of the night, headed straight for the chopper. The chopper lurched away and banked hard, just as Luke was about to jump. His foot got snagged, and he tumbled off the bench. The rocket zoomed by. His gun clattered away. He grabbed for anything. He was falling. The chopper was out over nothing. Upside down, he caught the landing gear of the chopper with one hand and swung wildly. The cliff face was way over there. Below him, the sky fell away into the darkness. "I'm still here!" he screamed. "Jacob! Rachel!" A blat of machine gun fire hit the side of the chopper, tearing up metal. "Jacob!" The chopper banked again and raced back toward the mountain. Luke dangled, hanging free by one hand. His body swung crazily. He reached to get his other hand on the landing gear. The chopper zoomed toward land. Suddenly, they were past the cliff and over hard-packed earth again. Another rocket came sizzling toward the chopper. Luke let go. His legs hit hard, and he bounced into the air, his momentum carrying him along. He hit again, tucked his body, and rolled over the stony ground. He lay there, breathing hard. He tried to do a body scan, but everything hurt right now. Had his head hit? No. Could he feel his legs? His arms? Yes? Okay. He was operational. All he had left was his sidearm. He got up and ran, heading toward where he thought the girl might be, north along the cliff face. Behind him, the little bird launched his Hydra rockets toward Al-Qaeda. Whoosh! They screamed across the night, just above the ground, throwing insane shadows. Boom, boom! Double explosions as they both hit. Luke thought he saw the remains of a body fly through the air. An instant later, the chopper opened up with its M230 chain gun. The ugly metallic blat of automatic cannon fire was music to his ears. The thing fired armor-piercing, explosive 30mm rounds designed to shred on impact, 300 of them a minute. Da-da-da-da-da! Da-da-da-da-da! Luke ran, gun in hand. Somewhere ahead and to his right, he heard the telltale hollow bonk of the M79 grenade launcher. Ed Newsom. Dunk! The gun made a launch sound, all out of proportion to its destructive power. It sounded like it had just served a tennis ball. The grenade skidded across the dark on a nearly flat trajectory. Boom! Another bright explosion. The ground shook from it. But the bad guys weren't done. A missile fired, whistling this way. Bang! It hit somewhere behind him. He turned. The helicopter was hit. No! He said. An image came to him. The bad thing. All those guys in Afghanistan. Wayne, Martinez. Luke had convinced Jacob and Rachel to stay. Always. He was always convincing people to stay. That was Ed's whole point, wasn't it? Jesus. The autocannon stopped firing. The chopper spun. It came down with a heavy metal crunch in the darkness somewhere behind a low ridge. Luke turned and kept running. There was nothing he could do for the chopper or the pilots. Up ahead, to his left, there was a spot of bright orange on the ground. He made for it, humping it over loose rocks and jagged edges. There she was. It was her. She lay sprawled out, her body in an odd position. The kind of unnatural position Luke had seen too many times in war zones. Elizabeth, are you alive? Her eyes popped open. American? She said. Luke nodded. Yeah. I'm playing dead. Luke's shoulders slumped. All the breath went out of him. He nearly laughed. Good idea, he said. There was a sound behind him, breathing, feet running on gravel. He turned, and it was a man, skinny, bearded, running with a rifle. Luke shot from the hip and put one in the man's chest. The man kept coming, crashed into Luke, and they tumbled to the ground. For a moment they wrestled for the gun, but the strength ebbed out of the man. He lay on his back, mouth hanging open. He might have been 20 years old. That thick beard was probably his proudest possession. He reached a hand to his chest. It came away bloody. He looked at Luke, mouthed something, and then died. Luke picked up the man's rifle. It was an old AK-47. He checked the magazine. Loaded. That was a bit of a gift. The kid should have fired instead of charging like that. Luke shook his head. His loss. Anyway, Luke was back in business. Elizabeth, I need to move you. I'm going to hide you somewhere. She shook her head. No, I'm not going anywhere. I should stay here with you. There's going to be shooting here any minute. And if that happens, you're going to get shot. Not once, but a lot of times. I need to move you somewhere safe so I can fight to protect you. It will be safer for me to do that, and much safer for you, if you are nowhere near me. She stared at him with big eyes. Where will I go? He shook his head. I don't know. We'll find a place. Somewhere to his left, Ed launched another round from the M79. Dunk! Luke checked his watch. 7:35 p.m. It had been a long day. It was going to be a long night. Boom! Ed's grenade hit somewhere behind Luke. A man started shrieking. He sounded almost like a siren. There was a fire off to Luke's left, where the chopper must have crashed. He didn't want to think about that right now. He held a hand out to Elizabeth. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. Luke had an idea. He walked Elizabeth to the cliffs. They were only another 50 yards further on. Sometimes cliffs were totally sheer, sometimes they weren't. He looked over the edge. It was a long way down. But just below, maybe 4 feet down and to the left, there was a narrow ledge several feet long. A stunted tree stuck out from the wall there. Its root system was exposed, thick and gnarled. Elizabeth, I'm going to need you to be brave. You've been very brave so far, but you're going to have to be even more brave as you've ever been. Can you do that for me? I don't know, she said. What do I need to do? You need to slide down to that ledge, get a good strong grip on that tree trunk, and wait. I will help you get down there. Elizabeth gazed down at the ledge. Luke could see what she was looking at. Just behind the ledge, the cliffs fell away from a dizzying height. It was dark now, but the truth was clear enough. The fall from here would be endless. Oh my God, Elizabeth said. Luke crouched low and moved to a ridge of stone 30 yards from the cliff face. He took cover and aimed his gun at the bad guys. 2 men were moving slowly across the rocks, guns out, stepping carefully. Their heads swiveled back and forth, looking for the girl, looking for the enemy. Luke fired on them, killed them both. An instant later, a rocket came screaming out of the night. Luke ducked and rolled away just before the rocket hit his ridge. Bam! The sound was more than deafening. His ears rang. He went deaf for a long moment. Fragments of stone flew into the air and showered down on him. Dunk! From somewhere to the left, Ed had fired back at them. Boom! Machine gun fire strafed the spot where Ed's muzzle signature had been. Hopefully, Ed wasn't there anymore. And so it went, tit for tat. Luke crawled forward like a worm and shot another Al-Qaeda in the head. From somewhere ahead of him, a flare launched. Luke was silent. The militia was going to probe with that flare and see if they could spot Ed's or Luke's location. In the brief glow of the launch, Luke thought he saw perhaps a dozen men crouched by a low stone wall. The flare began its slow ascent, lighting up the night. An instant later, a line of bombs dropped from somewhere in the heavens. They came screaming down, a violent rain, invisible, pounding the place where the flare had just gone up. Boom, 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 boom! 100 yards of fire and fury, a field of death, briefly turned night into day. The explosions echoed across the mountains and back. In the aftermath, there came the crackling of flames as something burned, possibly a small building, and possibly the bodies of whoever had just been positioned there. Drone strike. Beautiful. Hours passed. In the first bleak light, just before dawn, a squad of United States Marines appeared like ghosts out of the mist. They moved carefully across the rocky terrain. Luke ducked behind the ridgeline again. This was when people got shot by accident. "Americans!" he shouted. "There's Americans over here!" Luke threw the rifle away. He heard them running toward him. He kept his empty hands in the air where everyone could see them. 2 helmeted Marines came around the ridge, rifles pointed at Luke. "I'm an American!" he shouted again. "Don't move!" The Marines charged him, flipped him over onto his stomach, and began to search him. A heavy foot was planted on his back. The muzzle of a gun was at his neck. Rough hands roamed his body. "Agent Luke Stone," he said. "FBI Special Response Team. The President's daughter is 30 yards or 40 yards from here, on a ledge hanging off the cliff. She's wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. Don't shoot her." From the corner of his eye, he saw more Marines running past. "Boy, am I glad to see you guys." Ed Newsom picked his way across the jagged rocks. He was tired. He was dirty. He was scratched up. If he raised his gaze, the morning view across the mountain range was astonishing. If he looked down, the view was also astonishing, in its own way. Dozens of terrorist fighters littered the ground. They were skinny. They had thick beards. They wore head wraps. A few were alive and moving. Most were dead. Many eyes were open and staring, seeing nothing. He didn't care about these guys. They had an unmistakable look about them. They were foot soldiers. Ed had a date with someone else. Up ahead, a guy was sitting on the hard, dusty ground. He was one of the few without a serious injury. He sat cross-legged. The Marines had shackled his wrists behind his back. "You," Ed said. The guy looked up. His eyes were exhausted. He didn't have any fight left in him. "Where's your leader?" Ed said. The guy stared at him, his eyes round and concerned. He shook his head. "Ein Huzaim," Ed barked. Ed knew a little Arabic. The words were right. The grammar and syntax could go to hell. The man on the ground understood well enough. Light dawned in his eyes. He was careful not to speak in response. Silently, he gestured to his left with his head. The move was so subtle it hardly qualified as movement at all. Over there, perhaps 20 yards away, was another man on the ground. This man was also manacled, and he leaned back against some rocks. He had a leg injury, which the Marines had been kind enough to patch up for him. His right pant leg was cut away below the thigh, and the leg was wrapped in a bloody bandage. Ed walked over to him. The man looked up at Ed. He had jet-black hair and a handsome face. His eyes were hard and unafraid. Oh well, there were a lot of hard guys in a war zone. "You speak English?" Ed said. The man nodded. "Little." "Who are you?" The man smiled. "Who are you?" Ed reached down and ripped the right sleeve of the man's shirt. There, on the man's round shoulder, was a tattoo of a crescent moon and a star, the symbol of the Muslim world. The man looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. How did that get there? Instantly, he realized his mistake. The one identifying feature in the video was that tattoo. Ed pulled his sidearm. He pointed it at the man's head. Still, the man showed no fear. If anything, his smile broadened. "I should have gutted her like a pig," he said. Bang! The shot rang out, echoing across the rugged hillsides. The man's body slumped on the stony ground. A halo of blood began to spread around his ruined head. "Yeah," Ed said. "Whatever you say." A Black Hawk helicopter hovered overhead, its basket lowered to the ground. In the near distance, 3 Apache helicopter gunships patrolled the skies, moving in slow circles. Further out were more of them. In fact, the sky was black with American helicopters. Luke began to count them, but stopped at 15, because there were plenty more than that. If there were still Al-Qaeda militants alive on this mountain or anywhere nearby, they were not going to challenge those choppers. "Thank you for saving my life," Elizabeth Barrett said. She stood facing Luke. She was a head shorter than him. "It's okay. I was just doing my job. That's all any of these people were doing." She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek. "Who are you? What is your name?" "Luke Stone," he said. He thought about who he was and how to express it. He wasn't a soldier, a commando, a special operator anymore. "I'm an FBI agent." She nodded. "Stone, I'm going to tell my father about you." She turned and limped to the chopper basket, 2 Marines helping her. They would have carried her, but she insisted on walking. Her bloodied feet were wrapped in thick bandages. Her hands were ripped up pretty badly. She walked with her back straight and her head held up. She was a trooper. From the low ridge where he stood, Luke could also see the remains of the little bird. It looked like some sort of modern art sculpture. The landing gear had bent on impact, dropping the chopper over sideways. A rotor blade had wedged itself into the ground, its opposite number sticking up, pointing skyward. And the whole chopper itself had burned. Its burnt-out frame gave the impression of a human skull. Jacob and Rachel stood not far from it, looking at the remains. Somehow, they had gotten out. That was a very nice development. He wouldn't call it a surprise, though. Those two had been surviving combat together for a long time. Ed Newsom walked across the ridge, the M79 over his shoulder. He had gone to keep his date with the man of the video. "You find him?" Luke said. Ed shrugged. "I think so." "Well, you can still try to beat me up, if you want." A light went on in Ed's eyes. It was as if he had forgotten about that, and he was glad that someone reminded him. He looked at Luke, squinted, and grinned. "Nah," he said. Chapter 31. May 9th, 8:35 a.m. Arabian Standard Time, 12:35 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The Embassy of the United States in Iraq, a.k.a. the Republican Palace. The International Zone, a.k.a. the Green Zone. Kark District, Baghdad, Iraq. "Every single time," Ed Newsom said. 4 men stood in a rounded room of polished stone. As much as they spoke just above whispers, their voices seemed to echo off the walls. Big Daddy Bill Cronin was there, in dress slacks, suspenders, and a dress shirt with sleeves rolled to the forearms. Mark Swan was there in jeans and a t-shirt, ponytail pulled tight to his head. Ed and Luke were there, still dirty and rumpled and scruffed up from combat. Both Ed and Luke were like the Pigpen character from the old Peanuts cartoons. They were walking dirt hills. Big Daddy looked at Luke. "Yeah?" he said. Luke nodded. It seemed that way to me. Every time we went somewhere, they knew we were coming. That SAS guy got chewed up. But those were his own guys. I don't think he would... He shook his head. Big Daddy nodded. Yeah, he's been acting a little weird the past couple of months. I wouldn't put anything past anyone. It's a temptation over here. There's a lot of money floating around. You've seen it. No one said the word, but they were all talking about the same man, Montgomery. Now he's been shipped back home, Ed said. He's out of reach. There's no evidence he did anything. What are we supposed to do? Suddenly the door opened with a bang. The person didn't even knock. It was Trudy. Luke, I've been looking all over for you. I just got off the phone with Don Morris. Your wife went into labor 30 minutes ago. Don sent the SRT chopper to your house to pick her up and bring her to Fairfax. They can land at the hospital. He says you should come home right now. You might get lucky. Sometimes these first labors take... Luke was already up and headed for the door. Oh, man. It's 15 hours in the air. There's a stopover in Germany. I'm never going to... There's a State Department Learjet fueling up at the Baghdad airport. It's waiting for you. Direct flight to D.C. Luke was nearly out the door. He looked back at Big Daddy. What about... Big Daddy shook his head and waved Luke on. Monty, don't worry about it. I'll talk to him. Luke looked at Ed and Swan. See you guys around. Chapter 32. 6:05 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Camp David, Catoctin Mountain Park, Thurmont, Maryland. It's a beautiful morning. Lawrence Keller walked the quiet wooded path with David Barrett in the first light of day. The sky was pale blue, with shades of pink and yellow where the sun was rising. There was a slight chill in the air, which would soon burn off. It was shaping up to be a very nice day. Somewhere, a crow cackled, and further away, another one answered. Since the days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, presidents had used this as their country retreat, and as a place to host foreign dignitaries in a relaxed atmosphere. And Keller could see why. He mused that it would be just like a Robert Frost poem, except for the 6 big Secret Service men spread out behind them, and in front of them, and off to their sides. The men murmured into their collar microphones as they moved along. Their voices could be the sound of a small stream. David Barrett walked slowly and thoughtfully. I'll never forget what you did, Lawrence. He said it pleasantly enough, but he left the statement there and left Keller to wonder about its meaning. It was fitting to walk in nature like this, and to have the president drop a mysterious Zen koan on him. What had he done, in David Barrett's eyes? Taken control during a bad situation when Barrett was clearly out of control? Put Barrett on the sidelines until his daughter was safe and he could pull himself together? Derailed a misguided attempt to start World War III? Or was it that he had betrayed David, taping him in the Oval Office during his most vulnerable moments, and then using that tape against him? Keller had done all of these things. But what did Barrett think he had done? What are your plans, David? Keller said. Barrett took a deep breath. This is the happiest day of my life. So first of all, I'm going to enjoy it. I'm going to thank God for my many blessings and take stock of what the future holds. They've flown Elizabeth to a hospital in Germany, and she's still en route there, but everyone assures me she's doing fine. Later this morning, Marilyn, Caitlin, and I are all going to fly out to be with her. It's going to be one heck of a family reunion. He stopped and looked down at Keller. Is that what you mean? Keller shrugged. Sure. That, and when do you think you'll be coming back to work? You are the President of the United States, after all. The country needs you. I'm not really sure Mark Baylor is cut out for the job. There was a mischievous twinkle in Barrett's eyes. He started walking again. Some people are meant to be president, and some people are meant to be vice president, he said. I couldn't have put it better myself, Keller said. I think I'll be in Germany for a few days until Elizabeth is ready to come home. Then I'll take a couple more days here at Camp David with the whole family. My mom and dad will probably come up and stay too. That's nice. So I'll be out of commission for another week or so. I talked to Mark late last night, and he's willing to hold the reins for a bit longer. Good, Keller said. And I'll be there to look over his shoulder. Barrett shrugged. Well, that's why I bring it up. Mark would like to move you over to legislative affairs for now. He thinks you're a bit of a hothead. And he's got his own chief of staff, as you know. He's concerned that having you around will be stepping on his guys' toes. And I told him that would be fine. Keller nodded. I see. Okay. Yeah. I'll be honest with you, Lawrence. I've been contemplating a similar move for some time. How are you doing? I mean, you seem a little burnt out to me, like you're just not enjoying this anymore. I've been worried about you, and I was going to do something about it, but then this whole Elizabeth fiasco happened. Keller felt his heart speed up. A flush began to creep up his neck. I'm feeling fine. Never better, really. Barrett went on as if Keller hadn't spoken at all. You know Kathy Grumman from State? She's a real whip. I'm going to bring her on to tidy things up a bit. As chief of staff? Keller said. Barrett nodded. Think of legislative affairs as a lateral move, Lawrence. You'll keep the same salary as you have now, with all the same benefits, and the hours will be better. They're regular 9-to-5ers most of the time, unless we're trying to push a bill through. I'm going to need you to ride herd on a few of our reluctant friends in the House. You'll be reporting to Mike Donovan. Do you know Mike? He's been working Capitol Hill for about a decade. I'll be reporting to Mike? Lawrence Keller had never met Mike Donovan, but he knew who he was. He was about 37 years old, the son of the obnoxious, bulbous, alcoholic former congressman from Massachusetts, Mickey Donovan. Mike Donovan was a prep school jerk. He had strolled into his job because of nepotism, and he was 15 years younger than Lawrence Keller. Barrett nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, Mike's the director of legislative affairs. I like him. You'll be his assistant director. They walked along the path in silence for a moment. What do you think? Barrett said. What did he think? Lawrence Keller thought one thing was for certain. He was not going to work for Mike Donovan at legislative affairs. If David Barrett wanted to push Keller out because he'd made a tape of an Oval Office conversation, so be it. But he'd better watch his back. Keller hadn't gotten where he was by nepotism. He'd clawed his way there. And he would claw David Barrett's eyes out. What do I think? I think your daughter Elizabeth is a very irresponsible young woman who caused the needless deaths of dozens of people and who almost sparked a world war. Beautiful. David Barrett was feeling such a surge of joy that even his early meeting with Lawrence Keller couldn't drag him down. Keller was a problem, that was true. He was untrustworthy. Apparently, he'd had an outburst during deliberations in the Situation Room and had yelled at a general. Lawrence Keller did not fit the suit. Short, angry, uncultured. That was Keller in a nutshell. He was banished to legislative affairs for now, but he would almost certainly try to claw his way back into relevance. David would have to keep an eye on him. No matter. Elizabeth was alive, the birds were singing, and David was President of the United States. All was right with the world. Forget about Keller. This next meeting was the one he was really looking forward to. He sat in the rustic, sun-dappled great room of the main house. When he was a child, he would stare at photographs in magazines of Dwight Eisenhower and Jack Kennedy entertaining foreign heads of state in this very room, and he would think, "That's going to be me one day." Amazing. He shook his head at the wonder of it. His guest walked in, and David rose to meet him. David was a bit taller than the man, but it didn't matter. The guest was so impressive physically that David almost felt diminished in his presence. The man was broad and muscular. His eyes were sharp and intelligent and aware, in a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His body seemed to radiate electricity. He looked like a man who never slept and who never needed to sleep. The only concessions he'd made to age were the gray in his flat-top haircut and the crow's feet around his eyes. He was Don Morris, decorated combat veteran of many wars, pioneer of the very concept of military special operations, and the director of the brand-new FBI Special Response Team. His agents had saved Elizabeth's life. He wore dress pants and a dark blazer. His light blue dress shirt was open at the collar. He was meeting the President of the United States, and he dressed down. It was perfect. The man was a legend. "Mr. President," he said, extending a hand, "it's an honor to meet you, sir." Barrett took Morris's hand. He noted that Morris's handshake was firm, but not too firm. There was the sense that the man was holding back tremendous strength, which could crush David Barrett's hand to mulch. Barrett shook his head. Don, call me David, please. Won't you sit down? What can we get for you? Anything at all. Water, soda, beer? I know it's early, but if you want something, you can have it. We can have them make us lunch." Morris shook his head. "No, sir. I'm fine. Thank you. That's very kind." They sat down. "I know we've talked once before, haven't we?" Don nodded. "Yes, sir. We talked briefly on the phone just a few weeks ago." "That's great," David said. "I remember that." He felt foolish. These pleasantries were not at all what he wanted to come out of his mouth. "I want to tell you how grateful I am. How grateful my wife is, and our parents. I think we are the most grateful family in America at this moment. We owe you a debt that we can never adequately repay." Don shrugged. "Sir, I appreciate that, but I had very little to do with the operation that saved your daughter. It happened because of the initiative, and frankly the guts, shown by our field agents, Luke Stone and Edward Newsom. And they had a big assist from our intelligence team, from a covert CIA agent it's better I do not name, crack helicopter pilots, and dozens of on-the-ground troops. A lot of people made this thing happen." I know that," David Barrett said. "It's wonderful, the people who do these dangerous jobs. But I'll tell you, I'm fascinated by the career you've had and the work you do. I'm very excited that you've started this new agency. And I want to meet your people. The best of the best, isn't that what you told me? Like a civilian Delta Force?" Morris nodded. "That is exactly what I said. You have an excellent memory." "Well, Don, I'm hoping we can all work closely together going forward." Don Morris smiled. "I would like that, sir. I hope we can, too." Chapter 33. 4:30 p.m. British Summer Time, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Portobello Road, Notting Hill, London, England. It was time to go. Andrew Montgomery came out of his pale blue Victorian-era terrace house, carrying 2 suitcases. There were no clothes in the suitcases. His clothes were already in the car. No, the suitcases held nothing but cash, and a lot of it. His time in Iraq had been well spent. At first, he had been called on the carpet for the death of that Special Air Service lad, but now that it turned out the man was a hero who had not died in vain, but who had been instrumental in helping discover the location of the American president's daughter, well, the winds had blown back in Monty's favor a bit. Even so, there were worse things than career setbacks to worry about. Bill Cronin had called him 3 times today from Baghdad, wanting to chat about the operation. Bill's voice had a funny tone in it. It was a tone that Monty did not like. Monty guessed that his little intelligence partnership with the CIA agent, Bill Cronin, might be coming to its conclusion. They were never friends, he and Big Daddy, and work relationships eventually ended. Sad, really, but just part of the life. Monty placed the suitcases flat in the trunk of his old Porsche 911 Targa, next to 2 identical suitcases, also flat. making 4 in total. He put his clothes bags and his badminton rackets on top of the suitcases, obscuring them. It wouldn't survive a search, of course, but who was going to search his car? No one suspected him of anything. Nor should they. Bill Cronin was calling him a bit, of course. You might even say harassing him. But that meant nothing. Bill probably just wanted to tie up a few loose ends. He could be rather pushy in his way. Unfortunately, Monty was not available. He was leaving right now for a few days' getaway to his country house on the Welsh coast, near Carnarvon. There was a telephone at the house, but Monty was very careful about sharing that number. No, Monty was unreachable for the time being. In fact, he was thinking of extending the amount of time involved. A period abroad, maybe in some far-flung anonymous place, might be what the doctor ordered after so much time spent in war zones. The Seychelles? Maybe. The South Pacific? The coast of Nicaragua? It was hard to imagine a place on Earth where Big Daddy Cronin might not eventually find him. But it wasn't like he was on the run, was it? No, of course not. Big Daddy might have a few questions, but they were easily answerable. Monty slammed the trunk closed and slipped in behind the wheel. It was a beautiful cockpit for a car. They didn't make them like this anymore. It felt like driving an airplane. This was his favorite car, one of the best he had ever owned. He turned the key in the ignition, but there seemed to be something wrong with the starter. It was an old car, and these things could be tricky. He turned it again and gave it a little gas. A spark ignited under his foot, and then flame shot upward. He knew, even before he knew what it was. He reached to open the car door and get out before kaboom! The ground trembled. Someone screamed. Afternoon strollers on picturesque Portobello Road in London's fashionable Notting Hill suddenly dove to the street and took cover in shops as a beautifully restored Porsche 911 exploded. A ball of black smoke and orange flame rose into the sky. A moment later, the fire reached the gas tank, and a secondary explosion went up. "Help!" a young woman shouted. "There's a man! I saw a man!" People ran toward the site of the explosion, but no one got too close. The flames crackled. The fire raged. It was intense. "There's a man inside that car!" Chapter 34. 4:55 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Inova Women's Hospital Birthing Center. Inova Fairfax Hospital. Woodburn, Virginia. "Okay, Rebecca," said the doctor, a woman of about 50. "I think this is it. One last time. Give me a big one. Push." Becca screamed, a loud, shrieking wail. Her hand crushed Luke's. "Oh, God, Luke, I love you so much." "I love you too, babe. You're doing great." Luke, in surgical scrubs, mask, and gloves, like the doctors and nurses, stood watching. He had raced halfway around the world for this. He had dozed on the plane, but poorly. He never imagined he would get to this operating theater in time, but somehow he did. He was nearly out on his feet. Thank God for a long labor. He placed his head right next to hers. She was sweating. Her face was red. She was in pain. She was exquisite. "You're just doing so good. I am very proud of you." Every word he said was true. He was in awe of what Becca's body could do and the strength she showed. She was never more beautiful or powerful. Luke had seen a lot in his time, but he had never seen anything like this. He saw a small patch of blonde hair pushing its way out. The baby was starting to crown. "I will not freak out. I will not freak out." "One more, Rebecca. One more big one. Come on. Push!" "Arrgh!" She crushed his hand again. What he had thought was the crown was the smallest tip of the iceberg. The head was emerging like the moment a giant superheated bubble rises to the surface of a geyser. The head was massive, enormous. It couldn't be. Something had to be wrong. It was like a cannonball was coming through a drinking straw. Is that? He could barely speak. He could barely breathe. One more. Push! Suddenly, the boy was out. But he was blue. The child was blue. Is he alive? Why is he blue? The nurse was wiping off the afterbirth as if nothing was wrong. Gunner? The baby started crying. He was alive. Oh my God, the baby was alive. Someone pressed a pair of scissors into his hand and guided his hand to the place where he should cut the cord. He did it. He did his job like a good soldier. The baby was crying. It was wrapped in a blanket. Someone put the baby in his arms, just for a second. Luke was terrified, never more vulnerable. Then the boy was gone and placed on Becca's chest. Her eyes were closed and she was breathing deeply, the baby on top of her. Luke fell in love with her all over again, but in a different way this time. He could not describe the feeling. At some point, he was out in the hallway. His gloves were off. He had pulled his mask down, but he was still wearing the scrubs. A nurse put a hand on his shoulder. Good job, Mr. Stone. Thanks. It was nothing. He stared out a large window at the hospital grounds. It was daytime, and for some reason that surprised him. Strange thoughts went through his head, a mad jumble of disconnected thoughts. Sometimes things didn't seem to make any sense. He was a killer, he knew that. He had killed a lot of people, even in just the past few days. The world often seemed like a horrible place, and yet he had just witnessed a miracle. He thought of a short conversation he'd had with Don Morris, maybe an hour ago? Don had commended him on the mission, had wished him luck in the birthing room, and told him he was sure it was going to be easy. Don had commended him on the mission, had wished him luck in the birthing room, and told him he was sure it was going to be easy. There's nothing to it, Don said. I've done it 3 times. Then Don told him the mission had put the SRT on the map. He'd met with the president that morning. The president was thrilled. There were more missions right on tap, as soon as Luke and Ed were ready. Luke didn't know if he'd ever be ready again. The thought of going back out there? But he didn't tell Don that. Luke wanted more miracles, like the one he had just witnessed. That's what he realized. He wanted this life with this woman and this little boy. Maybe there were more miracles out there to be discovered. And maybe there was something else he could do for a living. He shook his head. It didn't even matter. Becca's family was wealthy. That was the true, unspoken thing. For some reason, they never talked about it. Luke probably didn't need to work again. He probably didn't need to risk his life or kill anyone ever again. Not for money, anyway. But he never did it for money in the first place. Why? That was the question on his mind today. No. Why did he do it? Why was he here? Why was everything here? Why was there something rather than nothing? Why was there a strong, beautiful woman in that room and a new baby boy, instead of no woman and no boy and nothing else? Life was a mystery. What was the reason for it? Love, he said, surprising himself with the answer. It's love. He nodded silently. He looked around to see if anyone had heard him. There was no one here. The hallway was empty. Love, he said again, stronger this time. This has been Primary Target. The Forging of Luke Stone, Book 1.